his first book, and his first book is called, well, he wrote and edited it. It's Oscar Waldo Williams, Saga of a Pioneer Spirit. So, Jim?
I'm really excited about this because usually when I do a presentation here, it's usually about Fort Belknap, and this one has nothing to do with Fort Belknap. So, and kind of the way I came about writing this book is just as interesting as the story itself. A lot of y'all don't know, before I came here, I was the director of the Fort Belknap Museum down in Fort Stockton for 2 years. And one of the problems in Fort Stockton was, even though we lived in a town named Fort Stockton, half the people didn't even know there was a fort there. And that becomes a problem if you're running a museum or a historic site. You're trying to draw people in. How can we tell the non-locals about the fort if the locals don't know about the fort? So one of the things that we did was I was asked to start writing historical articles for the newspaper there in Fort Stockton. It was supposed to be once a quarter. Eventually it moved up to once a month, and then it got to where these articles were coming out once a week. And sometimes they would just be one-offs, just one quick article. Sometimes it would be a series. Anyway, one of the stories that I came across down there is kind of a famous story in Fort Stockton, and it goes along the same line as the Hatfields and McCoys or the Clantons and the Earps. It's a feud. And in this feud, what ends up happening is you have a county judge and the county sheriff who don't get along. And things turn bloody in the town. What starts it all is the sheriff has, his name is Andrew Jackson Royal. He's got land right next to the county judge. The county judge's name is Oscar Waldo Williams, or O.W. Williams. And the judge accuses the sheriff of stealing. Down there at that time, sheep farming was a big deal. And the judge accuses the sheriff of stealing some of his sheep. Anyway, it turns into a mess. Well, not only that, but the sheriff was also a drunk, a browbeater. Evidently, the only people in Fort Stockton or in Pecos County that liked him was his family. And how he got elected sheriff is also under question too. A month before this kind of big event happens, what he would do is he'd hire migrants to work on his sheep farm, and he would pay them at the end of the season, supposedly. Well, what ended up happening was you had a lot of the family of the migrants coming up from Mexico looking for their family members. What he was doing is, instead of paying them, he would take them out to 7 Mile Mountain and kill them. And I think they ended up finding 20 graves out there. But he would end up killing these migrant workers, to the point that he started hiring migrant workers from further south, Nicaragua, Belize, and stuff like that, because those families weren't going to come up looking for their family. Anyway, so this is the kind of guy he was. A month before this certain event happens, he goes into a bar. There was one of his migrant workers that was demanding pay. A.J. Royal, the sheriff, finds out that this guy's in this bar. He goes in there, and there's a shootout that occurs, and his migrant worker is killed in public. A week after that, there's an election, and the sheriff loses his election. I wonder why. But the judge is reelected. Okay. Now you've got all these crimes that this sheriff has committed, not just against the judge, but against the general public. So after this election happens, they put A.J. Royal, the sheriff, on trial. He is the defendant in 3 cases and the plaintiff in 5 cases, all on this one singular day. So the whole day is set aside for A.J. Royal. They start the trial, and then sometime during the morning they break because the judge has to go look at a point of law. He goes into his office, and he hears this gunshot. He comes out of his office and finds out A.J. Royal had been killed. Now, whenever A.J. Royal had killed the migrant worker a month before, not only did A.J. Royal wire the Texas Rangers, but the judge wired the Texas Rangers and said, y'all both need to come here because this is about to get nasty. And so the Texas Rangers show up. They're there for a month. The day that the sheriff is killed, they leave town, and they don't even do an investigation. So with this story, what I do is as a historian, I try to find as much research as possible and present it to the public so that people can draw their own conclusions about this. So I write this article in the newspaper, and then I was invited to this luncheon at this lady's house, and we were there. She said, "Hey, I've got this lady that you need to meet." So I turn around to meet her, and she berates me, just tears into me about how terrible of a historian I am. And of course, as somebody who takes that prideful, I was kind of hurt. And then I tried to figure out what she's talking about. Turns out she's the grandson of the judge. Now, in my article, what I wrote was that even though the judge might not have been the trigger man, he knew who the trigger man was. But I didn't say just the judge. I said pretty much everybody. Even the Texas Rangers knew who killed A.J. Royal. He was just one of those guys that needed to be killed. Well, this lady that tears into me is the granddaughter of this county judge, and I just accused her granddaddy of murder. So she tears me a new one right there in front of everybody. So what I do is sit down next to me while we eat, and let me explain to you my reasoning on this. And so I do. I kind of explained to her my research process and the way I wrote it and the way I presented it. And she came around to mine. She saw it one way whenever she read that. She saw it red. She was mad. But whenever I explained the article to her, go back and read it again. It wasn't just, and you can't really blame the judge for wanting this guy dead because everybody wanted him dead. So anyway, I finally got her around to my way of thinking. A couple of days after that, I got a phone call in my office, and it was this granddaughter. And she asked me if I would be willing to write the book on her granddaddy. Now remember, a week before that, I'd done a terrible job writing, but now she's asking me to write the book about her granddaddy. And from what I had read about O.W. Williams, he's one of those characters that you just wish you knew. He just had a life that but I didn't know much about his upbringing and everything. And then to go back to this, so the granddaughter, her name is Janet Williams, and y'all are going to recognize this name. Her brother is Clady Williams. Ran against Ann Richards for governor and said some things that got him where he lost the election. But that's who asked me to write the book on it. They were both the grandchildren of O.W. Williams. So anyway, what I do is, and I've got all the records, all those family records are in my office, all the county records. I've got everything in my office to write this book. And so we sit down to start writing it out, get the research put together. And one of the things that I noticed was O.W. Williams was a prolific writer. He wrote about everything. Not only was his penmanship beautiful, but the words that he used were beautiful. And it was in stark contrast to what you think of the Wild West. It was just amazing to me. So I ended up calling Janet. I said, "Hey, listen, I don't want to write his book for him. It looks like he's pretty much written his book. I think what we need to do is take all of his letters that he's written, and some of the articles that he's written, and let's put them in chronological order. And then I'll go through and edit it and put footnotes in there." Now, there are some lapses in time. Sometimes it's about 10 years where I write a chapter in here that explains what goes on in that intermediate time. So I sat down to write the book, and so I told you the end of the story to tell you how I got to understand who this man was. Whenever you think of O.W. Williams, it's really like looking at if Forrest Gump lived in the Wild West. If Forrest Gump was born in 1850, because he was just this guy that showed up at these historical events all across the country. And like I said, so he was born in 1854, so that's 7 years before the Civil War starts. As a child, he got to see, he was sitting on his daddy's shoulders, he got to see Abraham Lincoln speak. He also had an original copy of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in his office. So that was very interesting to go through. And he actually had notes in there. But he just popped up in all these weird places, and I thought, this can't be true for a guy. I mean, so that's whenever the historical part of me comes in. Is this guy making all this up? I want to find out if this is true. And everything that he wrote, he might have a day. He might be, the actual date. He might be off on that. But that's it. He was at all these places. So, and then here we get into where this book talks about. The book goes from when he was born to the feud when A.J. Royal was killed, because there's going to be a second one from the feud to his death. The feud was in 1894. O.W. Williams died in 1941. So then you've got the rest of his life to do, and there was just too much information to put into one. But that book would have been that thick. And by the way, this book was published by 4O Publishing, which is the publishing branch of Abilene Christian University. I kind of got lucky. A guy came into the museum while I was kind of editing this. I'd worked on this for 7 years, but a guy came into the museum while I was doing some work on this, and we got to talking, and he was with Abilene Christian, and he said, hey, well, we've got a publishing wing. Send the manuscript to them. I sent it to them. They said, yes, absolutely, we want it. So that's how it came about. So he's born in 1854. He sees Abraham Lincoln as a child. And he's writing, this is a particular part of his life. He's writing, it's a letter to his son. So we just put the letter to his son in the book, and then I put footnotes on there. Whenever he says a name, I kind of fill in a biography of him to say who it is. So he's writing this letter to his son, and what he's doing is he's kind of getting himself to when he starts college. So when he's 12 years old, his parents put him on a riverboat and send him upriver to go to college. And he goes to college in Liberty, Missouri. Whenever I say back then in the 1850s, going to college, I mean, you could be 12 years old and be in college. And that's what, just because of his mind, he was able to go to college when he was 12. So he goes to college in Liberty, Missouri. He'd been there for about a year. He lived catty corner across the street and one house down from what's known as the Greenup Bird Bank. And if you know Wild West history, you'll understand what this is when I tell you. He's catty corner from the Greenup Bird Bank. He's been there for about a year. He's living with his uncle. He's been there for about a year. At the end of that street, on top of a hill, is the university. He comes out of class one day with a bunch of his friends because school's over, and he's walking back, and on this end of the street is the courthouse. On the corner of the courthouse is Greenup Bird Bank, and then one house down is his house. So he's walking, and they used to go play on the courthouse lawn. He leaves the college, and he walks to the courthouse. As he's walking to the courthouse, he starts to hear these gunshots. So he looks up the street, and of course, when they hear the gunshots, they all kind of duck and cover. All his friends do. He's got a group of friends that are about 100 yards ahead of him that have already made it to the courthouse. But he hears these gunshots. They all kind of duck and cover. This rider on horseback comes riding down right towards them and then turns at the intersection that O.W. Williams is at when he's 12 years old and takes off to the south. This is the first successful daylight bank robbery in America, and that's the James gang that just robbed that bank. And he was eye to eye with Frank James. He gives a description of him, and then Frank James later on, admits to the robbery. But he puts historical detail in there that James gang historians did not know. They didn't know. I mean, and he puts stuff in there not just about the robbery, but he talks about the weather. The day that the robbery happened, he thought it was unusual that the James gang had a huge overcoat on, a huge frock coat on. He thought that was unusual because it was extremely hot. And then that night, this blue norther blows in, and there's a snow on the ground that's 6 inches deep to cover up the James gang's tracks. That's how they didn't get caught. So O.W. Williams, in this letter, he writes that, and then historians in the 1940s kind of picked up on that, and it kind of helped them fill in the blanks. And I've actually got a letter, the Greenup Bird Bank that was robbed by the James gang. The museum curator there in the early 2000s wrote a letter to Janet Williams thanking her for her contribution of sending this to them. The James Gang Museum is now the Greenup Bird, or is what was the Greenup Bird Bank. And he's just 12 years old. He's just now getting started in life. He ends up going to school. After he leaves there, he goes to school, kind of bounces around. He goes to the Christian school at Bethel College. He goes to Christian school there. And what's funny is when he gets there, he didn't realize that he didn't know whenever he went to school there that his family is the one that helped start Bethel College. And so he talks about going and looking at the gravestone of ancestors he didn't know he had. And he's a direct descendant of them. Then he ends up going to Harvard. And he ends up eventually getting his law degree at Harvard. Now, a Harvard law degree on the Western frontier is just one of those things that doesn't happen. It's the diamond in the rough kind of thing. But he's got this Harvard law degree. He in some of his stories, he actually kept a diary whenever he was in college, and day by day, And even if he was really sick, even if whatever it was, he still wrote probably 2 or 3 sentences about that day. Every single day has got something on there. I had to edit through those and find the interesting things, because I mean it itself would have been 200 pages in print. But all of his information is fascinating. Everybody's done eating, right? One of the funny things that happens is they decide to skip class. That what they would do is you would have class in the morning, and in the evening, in the afternoon, you had to go to a trial and watch a trial. And then you took notes on that. Whenever you come back to class, you'd have class on it. He actually was, he ended up going to Chicago one time to see it was a trial of a kid. It was the first kid in America that was tried for serial killing. I think it was a 14-year-old boy that was killing younger kids, like 7, 8-year-old kids. He was actually a witness to that trial. But on this one particular day, they go to class and then they decide to skip class because they haven't got to tour Harvard yet. They haven't got to see anything. And so they decide to go tour Harvard. And of course, they're just opening up doors and walking into doors and going into stuff. Well, what happens is they walk through this one door and kind of take a back way into the building. They don't know what the building is. They open this door up and just walk through the door. And when they do, they're on the stage. And there's about 50 people watching. And they're performing hemorrhoid surgery on the stage. And he walks right into the middle of that. And actually, if you ever get a chance to go through the Harvard medical records, that incident is in the Harvard medical records. Because the surgery, it was completed without the anesthesia that they thought they were needed. But it was completed. And that's because of that interruption of them walking out on the stage. So he graduates from Harvard Law School. He actually he gets kicked out and then he's brought back in. And he ends up graduating. Well, then he gets sick. He goes to the doctor. The doctor says, you've got to move to drier climate. So he says, okay, I'm going to Dallas, Texas. Now, he's a lawyer at this time, and he practiced law just prior to this. He practiced law in Chicago. So he moves to Dallas, and whenever he gets to Dallas, he wants to open a law practice. The problem is Dallas in 1874, 1 in 10 people are lawyers. So there was no work for him. So what he does is he hires on with a surveying crew. And he actually surveys, and there's a part in here where he talks about Graham. They're going west out of Dallas. They get they're camped south of Graham. They end up that day coming into Graham, staying the night, and then they start their survey. And what they do, the county line, the Young County line, the northern one that borders Archer County, on the map it runs all the way to New Mexico. O.W. Williams and his surveying crew is the one who surveyed that line that goes all the way to Mexico. And it's still our survey line today that borders Young County and Archer County and Baylor and all the way down. He also surveys out the Block O of Lubbock, Texas, which is downtown Lubbock today. He's the one that does that. Whenever he's in Lubbock, of course, there's nothing there. And this is immediately after you had the Indian Wars. And he crosses Mackenzie's Trail. He talks a ton about that. Well, then he gets back to Dallas, and whenever they got to New Mexico, he heard about the silver mines in southwestern New Mexico. So he ends up going to Silver City, New Mexico, to try to make money mining silver. And of course, it's kind of the same thing with lawyers in Dallas. Everybody in Silver City, New Mexico was a miner, so he's got to pick up something else. He lived in Shakespeare, New Mexico for a little while, and he talks about there's a Wild West guy, gunfighter, Russian Bill. He meets Russian Bill. But and then he goes to Silver City, New Mexico, and he hires on with the mail service there and becomes the postmaster for Silver City, New Mexico. He's the postmaster there whenever Billy the Kid is arrested for the very first time. Now, of course, at the time, he didn't know who Billy the Kid was going to be. And if you know any of the Billy the Kid history, he ends up being, that's the first time he's arrested. He stole fabric from some Oriental traders in Silver City, New Mexico, and he's put in jail. And he actually escapes from jail by climbing out the chimney because Billy the Kid was a small guy. In hindsight, he's writing this, and he knows who Billy the Kid is. So he's writing, I didn't know that this guy would become Billy the Kid, but here it is. Of course, I'm thinking this is made up. There's no way he saw the James Gang. There's no way he's witnessed a hemorrhoid surgery on stage, and there's also no reason he's met Billy the Kid. It can't happen. Anyway, he does. He becomes he meets Billy the Kid. And the research on that with the people in Silver City, the historian there in Silver City, was just fascinating, because there's little snippets of that story that for a long time were thought to be legend. And with the way O.W. Williams writes it as an eyewitness, it kind of fills in those gaps and explains the story. So he's in Silver City for a little while. He hires on again with a surveying crew and comes south into the east, and that's whenever he comes to the Pecos country, and he finds Fort Stockton. But one of the most interesting parts about this is him doing his day-by-day survey of that county line. Right after they leave Graham, they run south to get supplies, and they go to the community of what now is called Bluffdale, just outside of Granbury. And they go inside the store, they walk out, and O.W. Williams is actually sitting on the porch of this store, and he hears this guy in the store talking. And the guy is talking in a way that it's kind of like O.W. Williams. It's real fanciful language. It doesn't match up with most of the people on the frontier at the time. He's just real eloquently. He speaks very, very well. So O.W. Williams is kind of attracted to that. He turns and he looks at him and starts talking to him, asks who he is. Do y'all, the legend of John Wilkes Booth, that he didn't die whenever he was supposed to die, and he ended up confessing in Granbury. The guy that said he was John Wilkes Booth, that he did this deathbed confession. His name was John St. Helen. That's who O.W. Williams met that day, was John St. Helen. And he didn't know that at that time, he didn't say anything. I'm the guy that killed Abraham Lincoln. He didn't wait until, now whether that's true or not, which I doubt it is, but either way, O.W. Williams met this guy who ends up kind of becoming famous. And John St. Helen, his story is ridiculous in the sense that his body was stuffed and he was toured around in circuses and stuff like that for a while. It's fascinating. But O.W. Williams met him. There's another book called The Border and the Buffalo, and it's about kind of like the last buffalo herd, which O.W. Williams was a witness to the very last buffalo stampede in Texas, the very last recorded one. And he gives an explanation of how these buffalo hunters would hunt, the certain ways they would hunt, the characteristics of the buffalo. He just goes into great detail about that. But he meets this guy that his name is John R. Cook, who ends up writing a book called The Border and the Buffalo. And it was one of the first kind of famous books that kind of drew Americans' attention to what the buffalo hunters did to the buffaloes, kind of the tragedy there of killing all the buffalo. But he met John R. Cook on this surveying crew. Anyway, he gets to Fort Stockton, and when he's at Fort Stockton, he has no intention of becoming the judge. But evidently, everybody in Fort Stockton is crooked. And he's the only guy there that's got any kind of law sense that seems to be fair. And he's written in on the ballot, and he didn't even know he was going to be on the ballot. His name was on there, and then they get a knock at the door, "Hey, judge," and he's, "What?" They take him to his new office. He ends up becoming a judge. He didn't run for re-election, and he opposed being written on the ballot, so he could open up his law firm in Fort Stockton. And then finally, things just kind of started crumbling with A.J. Royal, and he runs for election again. And then that's when all the tragedy happens with that feud. The funny thing about the A.J. Royal murder, Sheriff A.J. Royal murder, is, like I said, O.W. Williams called the Texas Rangers a month ahead of this, and so did A.J. Royal. Both of them called and said, "We need Texas Rangers here to fix this problem." And so the Texas Rangers, two of them, show up. They're there for a month. The legend in Fort Stockton is that there were 10 businessmen or 10 notable men in Fort Stockton that drew straws or drew beans or whatever to see who was going to kill A.J. Royal. He's one of those guys that everybody wanted killed, and the Texas Rangers were in on it. And that's kind of the legend that goes on. What I think gives credit to this is there was some kind of, I don't want to say conspiracy, but there was some kind of event put together where all these people knew that A.J. Royal was going to be killed. I don't know that they all knew it was going to happen that day in the middle of the day, but they all knew he was going to be killed because the Texas Rangers didn't investigate. Nobody investigated. He was killed, and the very next day the Texas Rangers leave town. And they just kind of, well, he's dead, and just kind of leave it at that. To this day, it's unsolved. One of O.W. Williams' friends, his name is Jack Rooney. He was the county treasurer at the time. He died in the 1930s. He died 3 years. So he died in 1938. Whenever his casket passed by a couple of these known businessmen that were known to live in, to be involved in this murder of A.J. Royal, one of these businessmen replies, "There goes the man that killed A.J. Royal." And that's the only confession that's ever come out of the murder of A.J. Royal. When he was killed, he was sitting at what was his desk. He's cleaning all his stuff out. He's got a person that's supposedly his friend sitting right next to him. There's a door behind him. Whoever it is kind of cracks the door open, says "Royal" real loud, and shoots and kills A.J. Royal, and shoots him in the back, in the back right shoulder. He slumps over. His desk drawer is open. He slumps over, and kind of everything kind of pours out into this desk drawer. That desk is actually in the Annie Riggs Museum where my office was at. You open it up, and there's, a huge blood stain right there. But it's kind of interesting because if somebody walks into, if you've got your back to the door, somebody walks into the room and says your name, what do? You turn and you look to see who just said your name because you're going to respond to them. Why would you not do that? Well, I think he probably recognized the voice. He probably knew whose voice that was, so he's not going to turn and respond. He might have said, "Hey," they came in and said "Royal," and he said, "Hey," because he recognized the voice. Or the guy that was sitting right next to him is the one that killed him. But the guy that was sitting right next to him was cleared. Now, where O.W. Williams really gets tied into this is because above his desk in his office, he had a double-barrel shotgun. The Texas Rangers, after he was killed, they came in and they told the judge, "Hey, Royal's been killed." And then they look up at his shotgun and he says, "It looks like one of your barrels has been fired recently." O.W. Williams pulls it down and says, "It sure does. I didn't shoot it, though. I've been up here the whole time." And then he puts it back up there, and that's it. Nothing said of it. Of course, I write that into the article, and what does it look like? It looks like Oscar Waldo Williams pulled the trigger. And that's what makes the granddaughter mad, and that's why I get berated that day. But that's also how I got to write the book. So anyway, that's what the book is about. So anyway, thank y'all. You have any questions for me?
Is it on Amazon?
What?
Is it on Amazon?
Not yet. We've got 250 of it. We're probably going to release them, do a book signing at Pratt's Books first, and then they'll do the... this was done... So if you know anything about the Williams family, Clady Williams and Texas A&M are... there's buildings at Texas A&M named after Clady Williams. So the thinking was whenever I started on this book, A&M was going to publish the book. Well, evidently, Clady and Janet got in a little spat, and Janet wasn't going to let A&M publish it. It is the first edition... 4.0 Publishing at Abilene Christian had the rights to the first edition. Texas A&M has bought the rights to the second edition, and that'll be the one that you find at Amazon and stuff like that. So anyway, that's kind of how that, and that's a big headache. If you ever get a chance to write a book, don't.
So Jim, if they do ever want to get a book, just
I'll have copies at the fort. Pratt's Books will probably have copies before I do, because I'll probably get my portion from them. But anyway, yeah, I will have. Huh?
You know when?
It could be within a week. It could be within a month. I don't. The family is in control of how these books are dispersed. So, Janet, in the ensuing time that I was writing this book, her mind just kind of went away. And so the sons came in and kind of took over that. And they did good by her. I mean, they wanted to make sure it got done and got done right. But kind of some of the plans that we had played out, they see it differently. And they're wanting it to be, Janet and I were wanting it to be released here in Graham because I'm here, and then she wanted it released in Fort Stockton because that's where this happened at. But the sons want it. They want it in Midland. They want it at A&M. So they've kind of done a different way about that. So anyway, but whenever it does come available, I'm sure y'all will. I know at Pratt's Books they've asked me to do a book signing there too, so that'll probably be in the paper and all that. So anyway, Thank y'all.
All right. Just a quick note, we do have a board meeting after this meeting. And Lion Jessica didn't get to speak long enough earlier. She wants to speak again.
Yeah, because I'll think sometimes. So if you don't find that you received the email, check your junk mail and look for it to come from Kathy Pierce. So, because some are going to junk mail. So.
And also, if you haven't done so yet, when you leave here, early voting, make sure you vote. You definitely want to be heard. Okay, next 3 weeks. October 21st, Lion Mike has the program. October 28th, Lion Bob Coleman. And November 4th is Lion Natalie has the program. So, do we have any other announcements? All right. If the tail twisters will stand and say the pledge.
I'm still collecting money. If you got money before you leave, I'd like to have it.
It's what an old politician's been telling me for 3 months.
Good. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.